Dr. Bikman's lab. Leaky gut. Is it real? Yes. Dr. Bikman on the Insulin IQ podcast.
This is something that is known to exist where there are pathogens or pathogenic molecules, so harmful things that will move from the dirty guts, which naturally, they're a little dirty. That's one of the points of interaction with the environment, where we are something from the outside is getting into the body. And so it's the role of the intestines to make sure that only what is supposed to come in comes in. And if something isn't supposed to come in, it stays in the guts. And so the intestines really do have an exquisitely well-built integrity to them to make sure that to really do its job in keeping the dirty stuff out. Now, there are instances when that starts to break down a bit, and now you have things leaking in, and that's why where we bring in the term leaky gut. So this is a phenomenon, and it doesn't take a lot to find ample peer-reviewed evidence directly invoking those terms, and then having ample studies that support the reality of it. When we talk about leaky gut, in the context in which I'm familiar with it, it is usually looking at the migration of a molecule called LPS, or lipopolysaccharide. This is a remnant that is found on bacteria, and it moves into the bloodstream and then elicits very strong inflammatory responses. So this is a part of a bacteria that a cell, our immune cells, in fact, even more than the prototypical immune cells, fat cells will respond to this, lung cells, muscle cells. I've published studies on muscle cells that bind to this LPS. So LPS is a part of a bacterium that will bind. It's something that the immune cell, or any cell, will recognize. And then in recognizing that component of bacteria, it will initiate a prototypical inflammatory response. So this is the cell's way of saying, I recognize you, you're a problem, and now I'm going to mount my defenses to get rid of you. So this is the molecule LPS that I'm very familiar with, that is known to move from the dirty guts, if you will, into the clean blood. So normally there wouldn't be any of that moving across, but that it does start to happen. Really, it's not that the LPS is moving through the gut cells. It's that it's moving in between the space, through the space between the gut cells. So when we have the gut cells, the cells that line the intestines, they are very, very tightly linked together through a series of proteins that make a tight junction. They're actually called tight junction proteins, and they can become loose. So what is normally a very tight junction becomes a bit of a loose junction. And now we can have molecules slipping through, or leaking through, if you will. So the liver is the first recipient of these things once it's moving from the gut. And the liver's the big downstream recipient. So when you have blood flowing through the intestines, it goes into the liver, and then it goes to the rest of the body. So the liver's on the front lines. But in fact, saying that isn't entirely fair, because the intestines themselves are really on the front lines. They have their own very robust presence of immune cells that would attempt to mitigate these problems. But it does mean the intestines become more inflamed. There's more inflammation as they're trying to fight this invasion of LPS. And then what slips through the intestines will go to the liver, putting a particular burden on the liver. But it's interesting because the liver is also the site of the solution. When it comes to LPS leaking through the guts into the blood, it's a matter of naturally we want to be mindful of what might make this happen more readily, or what might I be eating that is making my guts more leaky with LPS and other bacteria and pathogens. It's the two F's, fats and fructose.
Is leaky gut a real health problem? Dr. Bikman says, it does exist. It's where pathogenic molecules move through the wall of the dirty gut, called dirty because it has substances from the outside environment. It's the role of the intestines to make sure only substances that should come into the body do so. Intestines have an exquisitely well-built integrity to keep the dirty stuff out. When things begin to break down, you have leakage, leaky gut. There is ample peer-reviewed evidence using this term supporting the reality of it. Leaky gut, usually looking at the migration of a molecule, LPS, lipopolysaccharide, found on a bacterium, moves into the bloodstream, elicits a very strong inflammatory response. LPS, part of bacteria that our cells will bind to, including immune, lung, fat, and muscle cells. The cells will recognize the LPS molecule as part of bacteria, will initiate an inflammatory response. It's as if the cell says, I recognize you, you're a problem, so I will mount my defenses to get rid of you. Normally, in a healthy gut, there would be no moving across. It is not that the LPS is moving through the gut cells, it is moving through the space between the gut cells. When we have the gut cells that line the intestines, they are very, very tightly linked together by tight junction proteins. They can become loose, then they have molecules slip through. The liver is the first recipient of these things after they leak through the gut. Blood flows from intestines, first to the liver, then to the rest of the body. The intestines themselves are really on the front line. Intestines have their own very robust set of immune cells who attempt to mitigate these problems. But they become inflamed as they try to fight the LPS invasion. And what slips through the intestines goes directly to the liver. It's interesting because the liver is also the site of the solution. When it comes to LPS leaking through the gut into the blood, what am I eating that makes this happen more readily? The answer, fats and fructose. Annotated and summarized. Easy to share with loved ones. The description below the title for this video has these summary points.